This right here is what makes solo leveling, well, solo leveling. It's not some deep story with complex characters or convoluted plot elements, but is instead a portrayal of one man's desire to become stronger. It's the essence of power fantasy refined down to its best. Everything we love to see from them shown over and over, all of which leads to that same satisfying conclusion that we got in this episode. Now, normally I would ask for your comments at the end, but I'm genuinely curious to know whether you find the anime good or not now. Has it finally clicked as something you think you'll enjoy, or are you still on the fence even after that banger of an episode last week? Either way, if you're here now, that means you want to know more about solo leveling. So let's take a look at the full extent of Sung's rage in the novels and the importance of this turning point from naive hunter to cold-blooded killer. It was a series of events that can be summarized pretty much like this.
お前はもう死んでいる。何?
Okay, maybe not entirely, but that was to segue into today's sponsor for Figurama, specifically the upcoming release of their new Fist of the North Star Kenshiro vs. Rao statue. As an avid figure collector myself, I gotta say this 1/6 scale work of art is one of the most detailed I've ever come across. Like, all of Figurama's pieces shine in their craftsmanship and artistry, but this one here really does well to capture the essence of that final fight between the King of Fists and the Savior of the Wasteland. From the fierce expressions to the flaming fists of fury, every part of this just oozes with passion. I mean, you gotta respect how they were even able to capture Kenshiro's signature Hokuto Hyakuretsu Ken move. If you're looking for something a bit more classic though, this Elite exclusive figure also comes with interchangeable busts for both Rao and Kenshiro. So whether you want that OG look or something a bit more iconic, you can choose either for the main figure then display the others on their own individual bust stands, all of which come together as part of one complete package for it. So if you want to pick up one of these Elite exclusive Fist of the North Star statues for yourself, then be sure to click the link in the description and join the wishlist. You'll be notified as soon as it drops on February 24th at 9 AM Eastern. I recommend being there just before that though, since statues like these do tend to sell out within 24 hours. I'll also be giving away this on stream to remind you about it on the 18th. More on that though at the end of the video. For now, let's talk about solo leveling. Episode 6, The Real Hunt begins, covering chapters 21 to 24 of the manhwa and chapters 20 to 24 of the web novel. If you remember what I had mentioned last video, one of the core differences between Sung in the novel and Sung in the anime is the confidence he had when approaching pretty much everything in the gate. Opportunity was slipping right through his fingers, so when the first signs showed that Hwang and his group were going to betray him, Sung became excited at the possibility of all those opportunities returning to him. He literally couldn't wait for Hwang to make his move, simply because that would mean he alone could be the one to indulge in all the experience and essence stones. So, as Sung waited in excited anticipation for what he knew was coming, he continued to follow Hwang solely for this moment here. The inevitable betrayal in which everything would be handed off to him. He didn't feel bad or angry that this was the outcome, since in the end it was exactly what he wanted. It was that exclusive opportunity to continue getting stronger. It was after the group had blocked the entrance that Sung would then check to see just how trapped he was. As it turns out, the rocks were much lighter than he had initially anticipated. So much so that if he really wanted to escape, all he needed to do was apply a bit of power and move them. Of course, Sung had zero intention of leaving, since to him the boss in front of him was something he was fully confident he could handle right now. If it wasn't, then he wouldn't have let Hwang trap them or even walk away for that matter. It's because he knew he could in fact beat this enemy that Sung would face this spider with the calm, collected composure of an experienced veteran. It's another example of that confidence that I was talking about in the beginning. Yes, his heart was still racing and his breath speeding up, but his anxiety was nowhere near as close to the level it was when outside the instance dungeon. Compared to that, this was just another day at work for him. Now, the manhwa portrays this just a little bit differently, since the way he composes himself in that is mainly by comparing the spider to the statue god. When thinking about the completely different level that boss was on, this spider was once again nothing special to him. Certainly nothing he needed to be extremely concerned about. This brings us now to the fight itself, where the essence of the manhwa was captured pretty much perfectly. There was a moment where Sung commented on how he was losing track on how long he'd been fighting for, but that was just more of a descriptive lead-in for the fatigue concept. The novel, on the other hand, focuses on Sung's entire thought process, and it's here we see Sung reflect a little bit of shadow. What I mean is that, just like how Sid analyzes attacks then reacts in the most refined way possible, So too was Sung doing the same, then creating an opening for a counterattack. He was dodging the spider with the least amount of movement possible, then proceeding forward one methodically crafted step at a time. At first, the spider's attacks were nothing but a blur, but after dodging the first set on instincts alone, his focus on their movements made them a lot more visible. He began to see it was just a sequential movement of left leg, right leg, and that made dodging a whole lot easier. It was by the time he was in range of the spider's head, though, that something felt off as the spider's attacks were slowing. Initially, he thought it was just because he had gotten used to them, but his refined senses assured him that they were in fact getting slower. The sound of their impacts had definitely spaced out a bit. That's when Sung could hear the spider's mandibles twitching, and once again, out of pure instinct alone, he decided to dodge sideways rather than commit to the counterattack. It was a move that would turn out to be a life-saving one, since had he jumped forward, he would have been met with a face full of acid. The spider's counter for those who got too close to it. Sung would do his same dodge advance pattern to get in range of the spider's head again, but once again the acid would push him back. It seemed this combo of acid at close range and legs at long range was a bit more difficult. A challenge quickly turning the situation into something more dire, since it was clear who out of the two of them would get tired first. Since the spider was only using its two front legs to attack, it was far more strenuous for Sung since he was using his entire body to dodge. I mean, yes, there was zero wasted movement when he did, but at the same time it did still require incredible amounts of energy to do so. So, we know at 70 fatigue he'll become a bit slower, but it's at 90 and above that his breath would cease and his body pretty much stop. So, with very little time remaining to defeat this boss, Sung would rely on his skill instead of the status refresh. He would activate Sprint to get to the spider's head faster, and that alone would be enough to give him the advantage. This was another core difference between the novel and anime, since there was never that moment where Sung was losing. He didn't get hit or get pushed to the edge of defeat, and that in turn never resulted in him having to game the system like this. It's an added scene I think makes Sung seem a bit more human, since the novel hasn't really shown him struggle at all yet. Ever since he'd gained the system, every opponent he's faced has just been, well, easy. So for the manhwa and anime to slow things down and make encounters tough, to me that's an additional element that I think makes this power fantasy a lot more enjoyable. Constant ups and downs are a lot better than just a consistent linear rise to the top. So, with that being it for the spider, the essence core Sung had pulled was worth around $7,500. This wasn't all the cores he had found though, since within the spider's stomach was numerous ant corpses yet to be digested. Valuable loot he wasn't just gonna leave on the table like that. So, after carving them out and looting the loot of what was essentially the spider's loot, Sung had earned himself an additional 10 essence cores. Enough he believed not just to pay for rent, but perhaps even to get his own mortgage now. This would then lead to Jin-woo acting all nervous and eventually a promise that he wouldn't tell anyone anything. You see, Sung was planning to ask for him not to say anything, but it was right before he could that Jin-woo would assure him he wouldn't. It's not like Sung was planning to coerce him into doing so, but for him to go ahead and do it on his own accord, well, that did make things a whole lot simpler. It was actually something Sung was incredibly thankful for. Even if Jin-woo didn't though, it's not like anyone would believe an E-rank took down a C-rank boss anyway, a fact made evident when Hwang would come back in the next scene. To expand more on the plan he had for Jin-woo, the whole thing could be summed up as an elaborate blackmail scheme. Since his dad was the chairman of a $7.5 billion construction company, Hwang figured he could make a lot more money from that than pretty much any amount of C-rank gates. All he had to do was film Jin-woo killing Sung Jin-woo, then the rest would be a simple matter of using that as blackmail. Now, the anime didn't involve Sung too much in Jin-woo's decision, but in both the manhwa and novel, Jin-woo would look back as if to ask Sung what he should do. In the novel, Sung would simply shrug as if to say do what you want, then it was in the manhwa that he would just straight up accept it. He had accepted the outcome that Jin-woo would betray him and had chalked it up to him just being weak again. Of course, this wasn't a plan Jin-woo would follow through with, but the betrayal from the other guys definitely struck a chord in Sung. Not so much in the novel since the betrayal was expected, but in the manhwa that constant muttering of how was portrayed like this. He was truly unsettled by the fact he'd forgotten the world of hunters was governed by survival of the fittest. When he really thought hard about what it was making him so naive, the only answer he could come up with was his repetition. Time and time again he'd enter a dungeon, and time again he'd return, recover, then go back for more. Since he'd always overcome the life and death situations being a hunter came with, he'd eventually come to believe that dungeons were safe. He'd forgotten that each was a genuine tug-of-war of life and death, and he'd forgotten that just recently he'd almost lost that tug-of-war. So, as soon as he remembered what it was being a hunter meant, he had also come to realize what it was the system wanted from him. It was a revelation made clear when the emergency quest changed right in front of him, and it's what I personally believe to be one of Sung's most important turning points. Reason being that, by changing player to you and the penalty to a straight-up death threat, the message being sent was no longer something he could consider as part of a game anymore. It was now a direct message to him that simply said, "Do the quest or I'll kill you." Initially, it had left him a bit confused, but whatever shock he had at its aggressive nature quickly changed to comfort as he finally realized something. He understood now that the system was here to stay. Before, he'd always worried that perhaps one day the system might vanish, but now that was something he knew he no longer needed to be concerned with. I mean, it was only natural to think this strange occurrence could disappear as quickly as it appeared, and it was that thought that constantly plagued Sung's mind up until now. He neither knew how nor why this system was given to him, so it was that uncertainty which made him fear he might just lose it one day. As soon as he saw the emergency quest tell him to kill though, that's when he knew the system needed him as much as he needed it. If it didn't, then it wouldn't have had to use a penalty to force him to kill here. The system would have instead provided him an option to avoid the danger. It's because it didn't though that's how Sung knew the system had a goal of its own now. It didn't just want to make Sung stronger out of convenience or kindness, but instead needed him to be strong for, well, who knows what. That exact what didn't really matter though, since to Sung the only thing that did matter was the necessity for him to get there somehow. The system needed him to be stronger, and in order to get him there, it would even have him kill other hunters to do so. Luckily, this wasn't something Sung was too pressed by, since so long as the system's goals coincided with his own desires, he would happily be used by it and continue to use it. It was a small price to pay if it meant he could hold on to this phenomenon indefinitely, thus the feeling of comfort in the face of what should have been imminent death. A funny tidbit not shown in the anime after this was the inner thoughts of Gyuhan after Hwang made fun of him. You see, after hitting Sung with what he knew was his strongest spell, he was more than nervous to see this supposed E rank just get back up from it. As a spell that used 1/3 of his total mana, if that wasn't enough to kill him, then nothing else he had would. It was the reason he looked so anxious in the anime here. Another comedic bit with one of the other hunters was the way that this one had tried to intimidate Sung. We didn't get to see this in the anime either, but this position here was actually him trying to put Sung into a headlock. He would wrap his arm, then apply as much downward force as he could, but no matter how hard he tried, Sung just wouldn't bend. It was once this hunter realized Sung was just significantly stronger than him that he knew, for lack of a better term, that
he fucked up.
This would then lead to a part in the manhwa where Sung would remember only the strong survive, and that in turn would lead to him going into demon mode. So Gyuhan would be the first to go after this, then after that it would be the other 6 hunters. Most was either through an application of bleed or paralysis, but for those sliced to pieces, they were probably the lucky ones. If you're wondering what exactly bleed did, well, any person afflicted would lose 1% health every second. I'm not sure if that's percent max health or percent current health, but I would assume max since the hunters afflicted with it ended up dying anyway. Now, the core attribute which made this fight so incredibly easy was Sung's agility and its ability to make him see things easier. To him, everyone was just a whole lot slower, and to them he was just a whole lot faster. It was another instance in which the relative nature of speed was highlighted. So, as he weaved and dodged, cutting everyone down in the process, his final move was a ruthless chokeslam, leaving Hwang grasping for air. Unlike how he beheaded Hwang in the anime though, Sung instead kept his grip and continued to squeeze harder, ending Hwang's life in a far more brutal manner some may find unbefitting to his character. What I mean is that, while decapitation can be seen as this swift move done out of necessity, crushing his neck feels more like something only a trained, cold-blooded killer would do. It was a far edgier move than what I would expect from Sung, since his first kill was literally only a few moments ago. That didn't mean he wasn't particularly shaken by it, but after all was done, his heart was still beating normally. It was beating no different than how it would had he just been walking in the park, leading Sung to think that perhaps something else about him had changed. Perhaps the system wasn't the only thing instilled within him after the double dungeon. This wasn't something Sung would spend much time thinking about though, as the rewards he earned would turn his attention elsewhere, specifically at his brand new skill, Bloodlust. Since skills were something only gained through runestones, this was the most valuable thing that he'd earned that day. I mean, he did after all defeat the spider only because of his sprint skill. So, with one more added to his arsenal, Sung was ecstatic knowing his kit had one more option in it. It was a great reward that matched the severity of the penalty, one he could only relish in for a little bit since the cost of attaining it was rather hefty. When he remembered the people he had to kill to earn it, the reward honestly didn't seem that amazing anymore. This now brings us to the final scene with Jin-ho, in which the whole thing was just Sung figuring out what to do with him. So, when Jin-ho came to Sung begging to let him live, Sung, who was initially unsure as to how to proceed, quickly realized managing him would be a whole lot easier. I mean, with fear already working towards his advantage, all he needed to do was lean into it a bit, then Jin-ho would keep his mouth shut forever. Unfortunately, Sung leaned in a little bit too hard, so when he asked Jin-ho why he should let him live, he could literally sense Jin-ho's heart fall straight into his stomach, leading Jin-ho to offer money and whatever else he could. Of course, this wasn't the type of person Sung was, so after getting even angrier at the bribe Jin-ho tried to make, Jin-ho knew he had to readjust his understanding of the type of person Sung was. He would think back on everything he'd just witnessed, then eventually come to the conclusion that Sung was a patron of effort. He was a person who had no problem looting a boss for every last essence stone, but at the same time wasn't someone willing to accept handouts. So to Jin-ho, this could only be indicative of one single thing, and it was that Sung wanted nothing to do with anything he didn't properly earn himself. If it wasn't something he fought tooth and nail for, then it wasn't something that Sung would want. That's the reason he denied Jin-ho's bribe so vehemently. So what Jin-ho needed to offer instead was a proposition worthy of Sung sparing his life. One that Sung would know he earned through his efforts in the dungeon, yet one that wasn't meaningless like Jin-ho's father's money. It was a thought that eventually led to the idea of giving Sung all the essence cores, something I'm sure we'll see mentioned in the next episode. Sung had also gone to loot the 2 million he was owed from Hwang's wallet, then it was after that that the two would finally depart the dungeon. The reason I mention this bit of grave robbery is because it's indicative of the fact that Hwang wasn't always planning to betray Sung. I mean, if they cut off the tail every time they entered a gate, then eventually people would start to get suspicious of them. So, had those mana crystals not showed up right at the end, then the raid probably would have just finished normally. It just so happened that things went to turn out this way. But yeah, that's pretty much it for episode 6. A fantastic episode opening up the doors to what solo leveling really has to offer. I hope you enjoyed seeing what it is the anime left out, and if you did, then be sure to let me know down in the comments. Now, I want to thank Figurama once again for sponsoring this video, and remind you to join the wishlist for the elite exclusive Fist of the North Star statue. You can also use code ANI35 to get $35 off at checkout. Plus, in celebration of its release on February 24th, I'll be doing a stream this Sunday on Twitch and YouTube, doing some games in which the winner of all will get this, an amazing Naruto vs Pain statue from one of their other collections. So, if you want a chance at winning that, then be sure to join the stream on Sunday, February 18th at 7:30 PM Eastern. If you know your anime, you'll have a pretty good shot at winning this. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!